He never forgot a slight. And when you crossed Frank Sinatra, he didn't just cut you off. He made sure you stayed forgotten. These are the names he never spoke again, and the grudges he carried to the grave. Starting with Marlon Brando. On paper, Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra were two of the greatest stars of the 20th century. On set, they couldn't stand the sight of each other. What began as a clash of styles during Guys and Dolls in 1955 turned into one of Hollywood's longest-running feuds, not because they shouted, but because neither of them ever surrendered. The thing with Frank Sinatra was he didn't rehearse, he didn't warm up. He stepped in, hit the note, said the line, and left it perfect on the first try. Acting, to him, was rhythm and instinct. No frills, no fuss. Brando was the opposite. The face of the method acting revolution. A man who might sit in silence for 10 minutes just to find the truth in a scene. It wasn't art to Sinatra, it was a waste of time. He started calling Brando Mumbles. Not as a joke, as an insult, right to his face. He'd mutter it between takes, during blocking, even while cameras rolled. And Brando, cool as ice, never once responded with anger. He didn't need to. He got his revenge in subtle ways. One infamous day on set, Sinatra had to eat a piece of cheesecake during a scene. Brando, who knew Sinatra despised multiple takes, deliberately blew his timing, again and again. On the 9th slice, Sinatra slammed his fork down. His face was red, his voice shaking. Brando looked at the crew and said, "What? I like cheesecake." It was petty. It was childish. And it worked. Frank Sinatra never forgot the humiliation, being toyed with in front of a full production crew. For a man obsessed with control, Brando's aloofness felt like sabotage. This wasn't just about method acting, it was a war of masculinity, fame, and ego. Sinatra saw himself as the last true entertainer, a man who commanded every room he entered. Brando was the new kind of god, messy, emotional, unpolished. While Sinatra wore suits like armor, Brando wore t-shirts like he didn't care. While Sinatra demanded loyalty, Brando didn't demand anything. That imbalance drove Sinatra mad. Critics noticed the tension. Even though Sinatra delivered stronger musical performances, the press couldn't stop talking about Brando. His quiet intensity, his unpredictable magnetism. Frank Sinatra, the veteran, was being overshadowed by a man who barely seemed to be trying. And that cut deep. In interviews years later, Brando referred to Sinatra not as a rival, but as a saloon singer. It wasn't rage, it was condescension. To Brando, Sinatra was never an actor, just a voice in a suit. That dismissal stung far worse than any public insult. It was the kind of thing Sinatra couldn't fight, because Brando had nothing to lose. And Brando never acknowledged the feud as anything serious. When asked if he'd ever work with Sinatra again, he shrugged. "Probably not," he said, like it was the weather. Frank Sinatra, on the other hand, refused to speak Brando's name if he didn't have to. Friends who knew better. Dean Martin once joked, if those two ever hugged, the earth would split. But even he knew it would never happen. People tried to smooth things over. Publicists, mutual friends, producers. They all failed. There was no fixing something that had never been admitted out loud. The feud didn't need words. It just hung in the air, thick with ego and silence. In the 1960s, Brando became more radical, marching with Martin Luther King Jr., rejecting roles he felt were politically offensive, refusing to attend the Oscars. Sinatra, meanwhile, was still clinging to his Kennedy connections and waving the American flag. He thought Brando was a show-off, a rebel without a cause. Brando thought Sinatra was a relic. Even in ideology, they couldn't meet halfway. For Frank Sinatra, loyalty to country was loyalty to identity. For Brando, it was more complicated, messy, emotional, and sometimes performative. Just like his acting. The bitter truth? They were more alike than either would admit. Both were raised working class. Both had enormous talents and even bigger tempers. Both demanded respect and cut people off when they didn't get it. But where Sinatra doubled down on control, Brando drifted into chaos. And when you put chaos next to control, control always looks rigid, cold, even afraid. Brando died in 2004. Sinatra had passed 6 years earlier. There were no tributes from Frank, no hidden letter, no softening with age. It wasn't about hate anymore. It was about the principle. If you made Sinatra feel small, he didn't forgive it. And Marlon Brando, by simply not caring, made him feel the smallest of all. And that was the end of it. Next up, Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters didn't laugh at his jokes. She didn't lower her eyes. And when Frank Sinatra raised his voice on set, she didn't back down. That alone was enough to put her on his list. They clashed during the filming of Meet Danny Wilson in 1952, a time when Sinatra was fighting for his career and fighting with everyone around him. But Shelley Winters? She didn't care about his crisis. She cared about the work. And when he crossed the line, she didn't pretend it never happened. Sinatra was spiraling when Meet Danny Wilson went into production. His music career was slipping. The movie offers were drying up. And Ava Gardner, the woman he couldn't seem to live with or without, had just ripped his heart out again. He walked on set angry, tight, unpredictable. For some actors, that volatility might have read as passion. For Winters, it read as pure ego. From the very first week, the tension was obvious. Sinatra was moody, distant, sometimes hours late. He'd redo takes on a whim, storm off without warning. Winters didn't just tolerate it. She challenged it. She was direct, sharp-tongued, and, worst of all for Sinatra, unimpressed. Behind the scenes, crew members whispered about the fights. One day, he allegedly threw a chair across the soundstage. Another day, he barked insults at her in front of the director. The outbursts weren't theatrical. They were personal. Sinatra saw Winters as difficult, someone who refused to bend. She saw him as immature. Years later, Shelley Winters didn't sugarcoat it. She told interviewers Frank was a child who never grew up. And she meant it. While others in Hollywood handled Sinatra with velvet gloves, Winters didn't flinch. She said he pouted, that he sulked when he wasn't the center of attention, that working with him was like babysitting a man who thought the world owed him applause. To Frank Sinatra, it was a humiliation. He built his image around charm, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. But Winters shattered that myth in real time. She wasn't rude, she was real. And that was worse. He couldn't seduce her. He couldn't silence her. So he stewed. People close to Sinatra said he never got over the way she talked about him. Not just the words, but the way she delivered them. With calm detachment, like she wasn't afraid of what he might say back. In his world, that was rebellion. What made Shelley Winters different wasn't just her attitude, it was her independence. She didn't need Sinatra. Her career was rising. Her talent was undeniable. And she didn't treat him like royalty. That alone put her in danger. Because Frank Sinatra didn't just want to be liked. He expected to be obeyed. Especially by women. His anger, when it came, often landed hardest on those who didn't fall into line. The set of Meet Danny Wilson became a pressure cooker. There were whispers that Winters refused to shoot certain scenes unless Sinatra apologized first. Whether that's true or not, it fits the mood. The cold silences, the skipped rehearsals, the takes filmed with clenched jaws and no eye contact. It wasn't a romance gone sour. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power struggle. 13 Misters, treats, and Shelley Winters refused to lose. Sinatra later dismissed Winters in interviews, called her difficult, laughed off the stories like they were exaggerated. But people who knew him said he held on to that resentment for decades. Not because she had insulted him, but because she had seen him, and she hadn't been impressed. That was the deepest wound. Sinatra could forgive betrayal. He could even forgive criticism if it came from the right mouth. But he could never forgive indifference. Shelley Winters didn't just ignore the aura he worked so hard to maintain, she ripped right through it. In private, he would refer to her as a piece of work. Sometimes worse. When her name came up, the mood would shift. The jokes would stop. There was no closure between them, no quiet reconciliation at an awards show, no half-hearted nod in a late career interview. He never called her again, never worked with her again, never forgot. What made Shelley Winters different, what made her dangerous to Sinatra, was her fearlessness. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't dazzled by legacy. And she wasn't trying to smooth things over for the sake of Hollywood civility. She simply didn't care. And for a man who controlled so much through charm, through charisma, through the threat of exile, that was more than insubordination. That was defiance. Some of his closest allies said Sinatra had a type, women who knew when to retreat. But Winters stood her ground. Not dramatically, not with screaming matches or showdowns, just steady, stubborn resolve. The same thing that made her a powerhouse on screen made her impossible to control off it. And once you stood up to Frank Sinatra, you didn't get a second chance. The fallout was permanent. Even as Winters went on to win Oscars, star in blockbusters, and reinvent herself again and again, Sinatra kept his distance. He never said her name without tension. He never extended the olive branch. And she never asked for one. When Winters wrote her memoirs, she didn't dwell on Sinatra. She gave him a few lines, sharp, cold, dismissive. It was all she thought he deserved. For her, the feud was a moment. For him, it was a crack in the mirror he never managed to fix. She reminded him of a time when he was vulnerable, when his career was slipping and his temper was visible, and she didn't pretend otherwise. That alone made her unforgettable. And, to Frank Sinatra, unforgivable. Peter Lawford, he was family. Or at least, that's what Frank Sinatra made him believe. A Rat Pack brother. A friend in the circle. A man who laughed at the right times, drank from the right glass, and showed up when it mattered. Until one day, he didn't. And Sinatra never forgave him. The fallout began with a phone call that didn't come, and ended with Sinatra personally smashing up the guest house Lawford was supposed to stay in. The offense wasn't just social. It wasn't just personal. It was political. And in Sinatra's world, that made it treason. By the early 1960s, Sinatra had tied his reputation to the rising Kennedy dynasty. He had done the fundraising, thrown the parties, whispered into the right ears. He saw himself not just as a friend of power, but part of it. And Peter Lawford, married to Patricia Kennedy, was Sinatra's golden ticket. When John F. Kennedy won the presidency, Sinatra doubled down. He built a helipad at his Palm Springs estate so the president could visit. He planned for Jack to stay there. Entertainers would come. Deals would be made. Sinatra saw it as his crowning moment. Hollywood and Washington colliding in his living room. But it never happened. At the last minute, JFK canceled. He stayed at Bing Crosby's house instead. A Republican, no less. The excuse was national security. Rumors about Sinatra's alleged mob connections had made the Secret Service uneasy. But Sinatra didn't see it as a security issue. He saw it as a betrayal. And the man who delivered the message? Peter Lawford. He didn't say it with malice. He didn't have to. To Frank Sinatra, it didn't matter how Lawford said it. It mattered that he said it at all. Lawford was supposed to push back, to fight for him, to convince the president that Frank was safe, loyal, deserving. But instead, he backed down. He stayed quiet. He played the political game. And Sinatra took that silence as the ultimate insult. Sinatra's response was instant and violent. He trashed the guest house Lawford would have stayed in. Shattered furniture, smashed glass, tore up the sheets. There were no cameras, no press, just fury. Witnesses said it was the angriest they had ever seen him, not because a president skipped a visit, but because a friend didn't fight for him. In Sinatra's world, there was no room for neutrality. If you weren't with him when it mattered most, you were against him. Lawford had chosen diplomacy. Sinatra chose exile. From that moment forward, Peter Lawford was out. Completely. No more shows, no more dinners, no more private jokes at the Sands. He was cut out of the Rat Pack as if he had never been there, and Sinatra didn't hide it. When asked later why Lawford disappeared from the circle, he snapped, "He's dead to me." And that was that. What made it colder was how fast it happened. One week, Lawford was on stage beside him, sharing drinks with Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. The next, he was invisible, not even spoken of. It was as if Sinatra had rewritten the script of his life and Lawford's name was scratched out in red. Peter Lawford never recovered from the public humiliation. His career stalled. The Kennedy marriage collapsed. His drinking worsened, and he never got back into Sinatra's orbit. People close to Lawford said he was haunted by the fallout. He tried to explain it to others, but no one truly understood. "I didn't have a choice," he reportedly said more than once. But in Sinatra's eyes, he had one job: protect the brotherhood, and he failed. What Lawford didn't realize, or maybe just ignored, was that Frank Sinatra viewed loyalty not as a virtue, but as a requirement. You didn't get points for showing up most of the time. You were either all in or you were out. There was no gray area, and certainly no space for political excuses. To outsiders, the fallout seemed political. A power move turned sour. But to those close to Sinatra, it was deeply personal. Lawford wasn't just a link to the White House. He was someone Sinatra had trusted, laughed with, brought into the fold. That kind of closeness came with expectations. And when the moment came to choose between the Oval Office and the Rat Pack, Lawford hesitated. That hesitation destroyed him. Sinatra never issued a statement, never gave an official reason. He didn't need to. The absence said everything. And when reporters pressed him later in life about Lawford, he'd brush it off. Old news. But his tone, always clipped and cold, said more than any headline. The truth is, Frank Sinatra hated betrayal more than failure. He could forgive a flop. He could even forgive an insult if it came with an apology. But once he felt crossed, truly crossed, there was no return. Lawford died in 1984. There were no words from Sinatra. No flowers, no tribute. Just silence. The same silence he had used to erase Lawford from his life 20 years earlier. That was the Sinatra way. When he cut you off, he didn't wound you with rage. He wounded you with indifference, as if you had never mattered at all. What made the Lawford fallout different from the Brando feud or the Winters standoff was how sudden it was. With Brando, it was a slow burn. With Winters, it was tension that grew over time. But with Lawford, it was a single act, a single phone call, and a single choice that sealed his fate. Joey Bishop. Joey Bishop played the straight man, but behind that deadpan cool was something Frank Sinatra couldn't stand: distance. In a group built on loyalty and loud declarations of brotherhood, Bishop kept things quiet. He kept things professional. And eventually, he kept himself out of Sinatra's orbit entirely. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with a scandal. But it was there. And Sinatra felt it like a slap. At first, Bishop fit the role perfectly. He was the sharp-tongued comic in a sea of crooners and clowns, a calculated counterbalance to the swagger of Sammy, the smoothness of Dean, and the volatility of Frank. He was brought into the Rat Pack not for his voice or his drinking, but because he was smart, quick, and knew how to land a punchline without stealing the spotlight. But that was the problem. Sinatra liked to share the stage, but not the spotlight. And Bishop, with his rising late-night career and growing list of solo credits, started to shine a little too brightly. Unlike the others, he wasn't always around after hours. He didn't party like Dean, didn't worship Frank like Sammy. He played his role, then went home. To Frank Sinatra, that wasn't just strange, it was suspicious. People close to the Rat Pack noticed it. Bishop didn't always travel with the group. He missed dinners. He skipped hangouts. And while Sinatra wanted a brotherhood, a mafia of friends who stood shoulder to shoulder through everything, Bishop was building a brand, quietly, cleanly. When Bishop landed his own talk show, some insiders claimed Sinatra didn't send congratulations. Others said he barely acknowledged it. Whatever the truth, the message was clear. You don't build a solo empire while wearing the Rat Pack ring. Sinatra didn't say much. He rarely did when it came to betrayal. But friends noticed the tension. The clipped tone when Bishop's name came up, the way he was slowly edged out of events. Not banned, not blacklisted, just faded. That's how Sinatra punished you when you weren't dramatic enough to provoke a war. He erased you without saying a word. There were rumors, always rumors, that Sinatra was jealous. Not of Bishop's talent, but of his independence. Bishop didn't need the Rat Pack the way the others did. He didn't orbit Frank's son like the rest, and that made him dangerous. Sinatra respected loyalty more than talent. If you sang flat but stood by him, he'd lift you up. If you shined too brightly on your own, you were a threat. Bishop never insulted Sinatra. He never bad-mouthed him in interviews. But he also never bowed. And in Frank Sinatra's world, that silence was worse than betrayal. It was disinterest. And disinterest was the one thing he couldn't forgive. Bishop's exit from the Rat Pack wasn't marked by a fight or fallout. It was more like a quiet breakup. One day he was in the posters, the credits, the lounges. The next, he wasn't. No public statements, no drama, just absence. And he didn't fight it. Unlike Lawford, who mourned the exile, or Winters, who fired back, Bishop moved on. He kept working, kept writing, kept performing, and said very little about his time with Sinatra. That silence may have protected him, but it also confirmed what Frank had already decided. He wasn't family anymore. The irony? Bishop had once said, half-jokingly, that Sinatra was the best boss he ever had. But Frank didn't want to be your boss. He wanted to be your king, your brother, your cause. And Joey Bishop treated him like a colleague. That was the quiet betrayal, and Frank Sinatra never forgave it. Other rivals. Dominic Dunne was never part of the inner circle, but he got close enough to see the cracks. And when he finally spoke up about Frank Sinatra, the response was immediate and brutal. Dunne publicly criticized Sinatra's behavior at a high society event in Palm Springs, calling him out for his arrogance, his entourage, his temper. It was a rare move in an industry built on silence and self-preservation. Sinatra didn't just take it personally. He took it as an attack on his legend. From that moment on, Dunne was blacklisted in every sense that mattered. No acknowledgement, no forgiveness. Sinatra treated him like a traitor who dared to speak the truth in front of company. Dunne once wrote that being on Sinatra's bad side closed more doors than I even knew were open. That wasn't an exaggeration, that was power. Lee J. Cobb learned the same lesson, only this time on set. During the filming of The Pride and the Passion, Cobb clashed with Sinatra over control, both in performance and authority. Cobb was a heavyweight actor, grounded in stage work and dramatic discipline. Sinatra didn't care. He didn't like being directed. He didn't like being challenged. And he especially didn't like being told how to act. On more than one occasion, Sinatra refused to redo a scene if Cobb was involved. Crew members remembered the tension like static in the air. Not explosive, but sharp. A quiet war of presence. Cobb would hold the silence longer than necessary. Sinatra would storm out mid-rehearsal. The feud never made headlines, but it hung over the entire shoot, and when the film wrapped, they never worked together again. Then there were the directors and producers, the ones who crossed the invisible line and paid the price. Names rarely made it into print, but stories did. One producer asked Sinatra to arrive on time. He showed up 3 hours late, and then left 10 minutes into rehearsal. A director once tried to give him notes. Sinatra lit a cigarette, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "You got 5 seconds to walk away." Another time, he simply left the set mid-shoot. No warning, no explanation. To outsiders, it looked like diva behavior, but to those who knew him, it was something deeper. A man so obsessed with control that any challenge, no matter how small, became a threat to his identity. Sinatra didn't just want to star in a film, he wanted to command the room. And when someone tried to take even a sliver of that power away, he cut them off. Quietly. Completely. Permanently. There were no second chances. Not with Frank Sinatra. He didn't believe in slow burns or making amends. You could spend years building rapport, one moment to ruin it. Whether you were a journalist, a co-star, or just someone who said the wrong thing at the wrong table. If he saw you as disloyal, you were erased and out for good.